Now from WATN, it's Local 24 This Week with Richard Ransom.
For the real story behind the big stories, welcome to Local 24 This Week. It's our chance every week to ask newsmakers and truly informed experts their thoughts on the week's headlines so we can give you the context and perspective that is so often overlooked in the day-to-day coverage. Before I introduce my roundtable, here are the topics for this Sunday's show. Senate race. Haslam and Green are out, so who's in? Two men from West Tennessee are mentioned pretty prominently. Lee Harris versus the U of M. Harris says the living wage is a matter of conscience and principle, and that's why he vetoed a new pool for the university, pressuring the U of M to bring all its workers up to $15 an hour. But why wasn't the wage good enough for his own campaign staff? And on the campaign trail, a candidate for Mississippi governor from Hernando making national headlines over his stance on being alone with female reporters. And it's the week we learned where the money is going in the Memphis mayor's race, so we'll talk about that as well. But first, let me introduce to you my roundtable that I'm so happy to have with me on this Sunday. Otis Sanford, Local 24 political analyst. We also have political consultant Susan Adler-Thorpe with Thorpe Communications. And Lee Mills, my good friend from the Shelby County GOP. You were the former chairman of the GOP. And you're glad you're the former chairman. Yes. As most former chairmen are. Okay. Let's start by talking about the Republican race for U.S. Senate. This week, the bombshell announcement came that Governor Bill Haslam, who has billions of dollars in personal wealth, had unbelievable popularity numbers when he left the office of governor, decided, nope, I'm going to sit this out. I'm not going to become governor after thinking about it for a very long time, 6 months. And then we also had another congressman who everyone thought was going to run, decided that he doesn't want the race either, Congressman Green. So now you have, well, who is it going to be? And the names that we're hearing most often are, we have a graphic that shows you Stephen Fincher, the former District 8 congressman from this side of the state, David Kustoff, who now represents District 8, and also Bill Hagerty, who is a Tennessean with lots of ties to the Trump family, apparently, and is now the U.S. ambassador to Japan. So first, let's talk about about Haslam deciding not to run. Lee, what do you think was behind that decision?
Well, this is an onion, and there's lots of layers to the onion. You know, he served for 16 years, 2 terms as Knoxville mayor. He's also served as 2 terms of governor. He said when he got into this that he wasn't going to do this forever. He's a man of his word. That's one layer to it. I know Otis is going to disagree with me, but I think he's actually enjoying his family and his quiet time. So that's.
Well, then why does it take 6 months to decide that?
Well, you know. Family? I don't know. It's a great question. It's a legitimate question, but I do think that is a major part of it.
Okay. All right, Otis. You said earlier you think this flank, the right flank, is something he just didn't want to tackle.
Yeah, and that's where I don't totally disagree with what Lee says about wanting to be with family. I mean, he's a family man. There's no question about that. But there was a right wing out there that was not a Bill Haslam fan. They have made that known even up to the last several months. There was one thing telling about, and I read his entire statement the other day when he just announced that he was not going to run. There was one statement, one line in that statement that really stuck out for me, and he said, he talked about the political disagreements that too often define our current environment. Well, I took that to mean there's too much arguing and partisanship. Bill Haslam has governed using compromise, conciliation, and you don't have that anywhere in Congress these days. I don't think he wanted to be a part of that. I don't think he wanted to run a race and be attacked viciously by members, so-called members of his own party. I think if he had gotten through it, he would have easily gotten elected, but I just don't think he wants to run that and then be in a Senate where there's fighting all the time.
Susan, Haslam said that he did not vote for Trump. And when that happened years ago, I wondered then, how's he ever going to run for a statewide office in a deep red state like Tennessee?
Well, Tennessee is a deep red state, and you're right. But and depending on who his opponents would be in the primary, he may very well have a very difficult time on the far right. But after reading Haslam's statement that he wasn't going to run, I had undertones of Bob Corker in this decision. That Bob Corker, who was really a popular senator for a long, long time, decided not to run. A lot of it was because this bickering, this infighting, and the assault from the right flank. So, and you know, I have never seen a politician ever say that they weren't going to run for any reason other than I want to be with my family. They all want to go home and be with their family. So there, as Lee pointed out, there are more layers to this, and I think Otis is absolutely right. The foreboding one is the difficulty of the race. Don't forget the Republican primary that we went through just for the U.S. Senate for Corker's seat, the one that Marsha Blackburn won, and the viciousness between Boyd and Diane Black and Marsha Blackburn. I mean, it was brutal. And my guess is Haslam doesn't really want to go through that, and he doesn't see a certainty of a win at the end.
Well, Diane Black has been asked, is she interested in running this time, and she has said no, but some folks are being a little more coy about their answers. That graphic we had earlier, Stephen Fincher, David Kustoff, and Mr. Hagerty, Bill Hagerty. Why don't you handicap how you look at these three candidates? You can take them one at a time, Lee.
One at a time. Stephen Fincher has a name recognition problem right now. He's been out of politics for a while. He's a great guy, I think. He's personable. His upside is he's got $2 million in the bank. So that's helpful. David Kustoff, he's a great guy. He's a hard worker. He's a great congressman. People love him. I just don't know that it's the right time for him. I haven't spoken to him, but he's only been in office 3.5 years. He's got to run for re-election. He's got to decide real soon. Hagerty, now Hagerty is the outsider. He's also very, very wealthy. He is kind of a Bill Haslam because he's very wealthy and he's kind of connected to the moderate side, but he was also appointed by President Trump, so he could be the big swinger there.
Well, I know, Otis, you think whoever Trump anoints is probably the one that will be the nominee.
And whoever bows to Trump will be the one to get the nod here. It's all about Donald Trump here because whoever it is, especially in a primary, they're going to wrap themselves like a cheap suit around Donald Trump.
Well, of those three, David Kustoff is certainly the one who has stepped forward constantly and says he's behind Trump and he's a real Trump supporter. If I were a betting woman, I'd say, like Lee indicated, I don't think David's going to run. 3 years in office, and he doesn't have the money. He'd have to raise $4 to $5 million at least. That's a lot of money to raise, and I'm not sure that it's time for him to do that.
A statewide race is so grueling. Do any of these three have any idea what it would mean to run a statewide race?
Oh, I think they do. I mean, I think Fincher has an idea of what it would take. He sort of toyed with this a couple of years ago himself. If I were handicapping it, I would go with Hagerty right now. Primarily because, again, he has the money, as you said. And I think that if David Kustoff decides not to run, and I don't think he will either, I think Trump will favor Hagerty, and that would be the one to get the nod here. That's the way I see it.
But I think David Kustoff is seriously looking at this race. But I think that a lot of it will depend on what kind of inroads he can make in the next few weeks with supporters from East Tennessee. We know he has support in West Tennessee. What happens in East Tennessee? I have a feeling that he's going to be our congressman from West Tennessee for a long time.
I will say that it would be nice to have a congressman from West Tennessee, senator from West Tennessee for once. And don't forget about Dr. Manny Sethi, who's in there. He's already announced and raising money.
Before I went to break, I wanted to mention Sethi. He is the only one who's announced. Trauma surgeon, has a lot of money in the bank, and has a personality that a lot of folks seem to be warming up to.
He's a very personable guy. He's been around the Republican core in Nashville for a while. He's hired Chris Devaney, who was Bill Lee's campaign chairman, so he's built a strong foundation for himself. We'll just see where it goes from here.
And remember, we had a surgeon before as a U.S. Senator, Bill Frist.
That's right.
He would have to get known more in this part of the state.
Yes.
A lot of people in Memphis and Shelby County really don't know who he is.
Because people are emailing me regularly to get on the show, so I think they are aware.
Which is a good thing for the show.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about a controversy this week simmering between the University of Memphis and Shelby County Mayor Lee Harris over the living wage. We'll be right back.
A drunk driver hit us head on. I am so glad that one of my family members told me to call the Reeves Law Firm. The jury awarded us $1.8 million.
If you or a loved one have been seriously injured, call us immediately. Let us be your voice.
Everyone who has ever lived has lived here. All of mankind's triumphs and failures. Every moment, every hometown, all here. we start our coverage on the ground and take it to the airwaves, so you always know what's happening in your own world and beyond. We are free TV and radio. We are breaking news. We are always there. We are broadcasters.
If you've been seriously disabled and can't work, you might be entitled to Social Security benefits.
I paid into the system for years and can't work. Now they tell me I can't get benefits.
Sound familiar? Give Team NST a call today.
At VisionWorks, we guarantee you'll see great and look great.
Guarantee. We say that too.
You gotta use these because we don't mean it.
If you don't love your glasses, we'll make it right. Guaranteed. VisionWorks. See the difference.
The Reeves Law Firm. The jury awarded us $1.8 million.
If you or a loved one have been seriously injured, call us immediately. Let us be your voice.
Oh, there's something so real about living local. And I know without a doubt I'm not alone. And I'm loving living local. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. Said I'm loving living local. Local 24 is always there for me. The Mid-South is where I love to be.
You're watching Local 24 This Week with Richard Ransom.
Local politics always fun to cover here in the Mid-South, and no exception with Shelby County Mayor Lee Harris this week and the rift with the University of Memphis. He vetoed a $1 million pool that the county had voted in favor of funding, part of it like a $10 million project, I think, and that was because the university still has not brought up some 300 or so workers up to the living wage, which is $15 an hour, and it looks like that veto will be overridden, but he created some bad blood with the university, no doubt, with that move, and wonder how he overcomes that. Otis?
Well, I mean, I think I said this before, and again, full disclosure, I'm a full-time employee at the University of Memphis. I teach there, so I don't really want to get into the inner workings of all of this, but I think that Lee Harris was picking on the wrong entity here to make an example out of when it comes to not paying decent salaries. Yes, there are about 300 and some workers out there who are not up to that $15 an hour, but there was a process in place to get there. I think I told you this before. I mean, when I was in management at the newspaper, whenever we negotiated, we gave raises on an incremental basis, maybe a 3 or 4 year contract to get us to where we wanted, where the unions wanted us to be. I think that's what the university was doing here. And you can't just all of a sudden jump up and go from, you know, the university was at $11 and I think 11 cents an hour. They were going to do this incrementally. Let's keep in mind that when I first got a job out of high school in 1971, the minimum wage was $1.60 an hour. And now it's at $7.25 an hour, federal minimum wage. That's 48 years, and we only made about $6 worth of progress there. So how are we going to go in one fell swoop to go all the way to 15? There's some efforts being done here. The university is getting there. I just think that Lee Harris was picking on the wrong entity here.
Well, he ran a victory lap of once there was a tweet that came out from David Rudd that said we have a 2-year plan to raise the minimum wage to $15 among university employees. A earlier comment had said it would be 4 or 5 years. Not sure. Maybe there was just a misunderstanding. I don't know if that was really a change due to the veto, but nonetheless, you see so many comments online from folks who are just really mad at the mayor, and he's like, I wear that badge proudly. He really believes in this issue.
Well, I applaud Mayor Harris for believing in the issue and standing up for what he believes in, but I'm a little bit in line with Otis on this one. It's not just, I'm not so sure that he picked on the wrong entity, but I think he picked on the wrong program within that entity. Okay. And this is an natatorium that has been established basically with private funds so that kids from the inner city who don't have the opportunity in the summertime and the wintertime to learn how to swim, which is a critical skill to have, they could come and learn how to swim and enjoy the water. And really, it's a life-saving skill. And this would be out of their reach if this program doesn't continue. I think withdrawing the $1.5 million from it was a little bit unfair. And remember, there are wraparound services that go with this swimming program that Mike Rose, the late Mike Rose, wanted built, and his two children are implementing it. And those services are lunches and food and a full complement of summer activities. And I just think it was the wrong program. I certainly think everyone should be entitled to make a living wage. What exactly that living wage is, if it's $15 an hour, or $20 an hour, or $10 an hour, I don't know. But when you're asking somebody to require them to have to produce a living wage, then you need to also know that they can budget for it and afford it.
And so your point is well taken. The pool was to benefit more than just the university. It was going to be a community would benefit
pool
as well.
Absolutely.
So we also learned that that when he was running for mayor, that Lee Harris had advertised for a position that would pay $12 an hour, and that the first 30 days probationary period would be $10 an hour. Some saw in that a double standard. We went and asked him about it, and he said that once he got some complaints from supporters that he should pay the same living wage that he was campaigning on, that he did in fact raise everybody's wage up to $15 an hour. What are your thoughts about this whole stink?
Well, you know, it's easy to spend other people's money, right? $15 an hour. That's where I come from. I'm not a big proponent of mandating a living wage $15 an hour. I'm a free market person. The market will decide what the wages will be. But you know, it seems like when you artificially raise $15 an hour, companies find a way around that, right? They automate, they do things. And so in the end, you end up actually hurting the people that you're trying to help, because they actually end up losing their jobs. But as far as Mayor Harris goes, kudos for him for increasing it, but he should have done it from the beginning if he's going to put the water with the well.
Right.
So
and let me say, I have been on record for quite a while here as advocating let's pay a livable wage. Again, if it's $15 an hour, let's do that. I mean, there are in the private sector, in addition to the public sector. I mean, I understand the free market issue here, but when you have companies and corporations where the people at the top are making millions and millions and millions and getting stock options and all this kind of stuff, and they're paying their workers who are actually getting the job done pittance, I see a problem with that. Maybe that's just that.
Well, it's worth pointing out, in the 1970s, the average CEO made 78 times more than his or her average worker. Now it's 291 times more than his average.
Exactly. So I mean, let's have some understanding for the people who are at the lower rung. They have to live too. They have to buy groceries. They have to educate their kids. They have to, and occasionally they may want to go to a movie. So let's look at this and look at the rationale behind the need to lift people out of poverty here, or lift people out of destitute situations by paying them a livable wage.
And occasionally they may want to have the opportunity for their children to teach them how to swim.
Well, that's right. That's right.
And I'm serious.
Well, Susan's absolutely right about that.
Yeah. All right. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the interesting contest in Mississippi governor's race, and the mayor's race too here in Memphis right after this.
Honey, this Geek Speed internet is ridiculously fast.
We are seriously keeping up with the Joneses.
Keeping up with the Fords. Keeping up with the Garcias.
The Romeros.
Patels.
Willands.
Right. No one's gonna have internet like this.
Xfinity makes keeping up with the Joneses simple, easy, awesome. Check out Gig Speed Internet or any of our other amazing speed options. Get started now for as low as $20 a month for 12 months. Plus, see how you can save hundreds when you get internet and mobile together. Click, call, or visit a store today.
Have a car? A title? You could get up to $6,500 with TitleMax. Go to TitleMax.com and enter your car year, make, and model. See how much you could get. Check out TitleMax.com for the most cash you need. Check out TitleMax.com and shop us for rates. Check out TitleMax.com. All credit types accepted. Find out why so many people say,
I got my title back with TitleMax.
I got my title back with TitleMax.
Get your title back with TitleMax.
I like that new Buick.
Me too.
I was actually talking about that Buick.
I knew that.
Did you?
Buick's fresh new lineup is full of surprises. Get over $3,400 below MSRP on this 2019 Buick Encore Preferred. Or current eligible GM owners get just over $4,800 below MSRP on this Encore Preferred.
You got ripped.
Thanks.
Off. You got ripped off. Whoever sold you those glasses charged you too much. Yeah, I'd be red-faced too. Next time, go to America's Best, where 2 pairs and a free exam are just $69.95.
That's a good deal.
You'll save on contacts too. So, you gonna bench now?
You gonna move?
Dude, I'm like 5 pounds. Muscle through. It's not just a better deal, it's America's Best. Never overpay, even with insurance. Get more with your vision insurance dollars at America's Best.
You're watching Local 24 This Week with Richard Ransom.
Let's talk about Robert Foster, shall we? He is the state representative from Hernando who is running for the Republican nomination for governor, and he has found himself in it, whether deliberately or not. We'll debate that. But he said, I will not be giving any solo interviews to female reporters unless there's a male colleague with them. The male colleague must be present out of respect for his marriage. He told CNN, hey, it's my truck, my rules. So let's...
Pickup truck, right?
Yeah, I assume. So let's talk about that. Susan, I'm going to let you go first on this one.
Well,
the female reporter, by the way, who he was referring to, says it's blatant sexism.
Oh, I mean, it's an insult, but I mean, you know, one insult deserves another. I mean, if you look at this guy's picture, why would he think that any woman would want to be in a room alone with him? You know, obviously, he's fighting for name recognition. And this is a very interesting way to do this, really in the wake of the Me Too movement and all the emphasis on women and women's rights and assaults against women. And, you know, I think it's lame. I think it's silly. But I have to tell, and it's an insult. And if I were a female reporter, I would suggest that another woman be in the room there with me and not me alone with him. But I have to tell you, in truth, I had this happen to me many years ago with a politician who eventually was really elected to high office. When he first ran for office, and I had the political column at the Commercial Appeal, and I called him and I wanted to interview him, he would not interview with me alone unless we were in a public space where other people were around. And I agreed to it, but I assured him he had nothing to fear. So.
Well, it's been interesting to me that on social media, the number of women who have said, way to go, Robert Foster. With the Me Too movement being as strong as it is, why take a chance that something might be misconstrued when there's nothing there? And they were in support of Foster in this decision.
Couple things. It's politics. People tell lies. People tell rumors. Things start. You're in third place. I get it. You're talking about maybe he's doing this for publicity. But remember, the Vice President of the United States also has the same policy. He won't go in a room with a woman unless his wife is there. So this, I'm not as cynical as they are on this. I think he's really doing it because it's his belief system. And if that's the case, then so be it.
Well, I mean, okay, if that's the case, then why was there a need to drag out that old conservative playbook? And then when people question it, he says, I'm not going to kowtow to the liberal media, the communists, the socialists, the Hollywood, I don't know what Hollywood has to do with this, who want to dismantle America. That's nothing but a conservative playbook there that he's putting out there to get some attention because he's in third place here. He's way behind in fundraising to Tate Reeves, the lieutenant governor, and Bill Waller Jr., the former Supreme Court Chief Justice. He needs some attention, he needs some money, and this was the way to do it, period.
This is a very green politician who, in my opinion, is not smart enough for us to even be discussing.
All right, well, I would like to move on because I want to talk about the mayor's race and get to the first, second, and third opinion on that. The front runners, I think we would all agree, remain the incumbent Jim Strickland, County Commissioner Tammy Sawyer, and former Mayor Willie Harrington. Lee, you take this first.
Jim Strickland, $1 million, is that what I've heard?
That's what we learned this week.
$1 million. Tammy Sawyer's got a long way to go to catch up, and I didn't really know Harrington was really running. I haven't really heard much about him.
He's been more active on Facebook, I will say that.
Yeah. So it's hard to beat an incumbent, number one. Number two, Tammy, Commissioner Sawyer, she focuses her attention on broader social issues, and I'm not sure how that plays in, say, the East Memphis area. So it's going to be an interesting race, and it might come down to money. And he's going to spend all that money.
The clock's working against me here, Otis, but Willie Harrington, one thing that was interesting was his fundraising and how much of it was not from Memphis.
Exactly, and that tells me that a lot of people in Memphis says you need to go to the house and stay to the house. You know, Dr. Harrington was there almost 18 years. I think people think that he's served his time. We will see a lot of Jim Strickland ads and campaign yard signs. It's going to be tough to beat him.
Susan, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. The people who are donating to Willie Harrington's campaign from out of state can't vote in the election, so what he needs is votes, not just money. And as far as Jim Strickland is concerned, I think that showing that he has raised $1 million shows really is testament to his own popularity and the support for that popularity. He's going to be tough to beat.
And let's talk too, in the couple seconds we have left, he is not conceding anything in terms of pounding on doors and pounding the pavement to win people's votes.
And going everywhere into this community.
Lots of black churches, I know.
And events, and everywhere, and it's comfortable being there. It's going to be tough.
He's a pro.
Anybody.
He's a pro at retail politics.
Absolutely.
He really is.
Okay, we'll leave it there. We'll come back to wrap things up right after this.
Have you or a loved one been diagnosed with ovarian cancer after regular use of Johnson & Johnson baby powder? You may be entitled to compensation. A December 2018 Reuters news report states that from 1971 to the early 2000s, Johnson & Johnson was aware their raw talc and finished powders sometimes tested positive for small amounts of asbestos, but didn't disclose it to regulators or the public. Substantial verdicts have already been awarded because of Johnson & Johnson's failure to warn the public of this risk, including a $4.69 billion verdict in July of 2018 and 3 other verdicts totaling over $614 million. If you or a loved one has been diagnosed with ovarian cancer after regular use of Johnson & Johnson baby powder for feminine hygiene purposes, you may be entitled to compensation. How do you fight for the compensation you deserve? You choose the right legal team that has the experience, support staff, and resources to get the most compensation for your injuries. Call now.
First 6-function multi-pro tailgate, available only on the next generation GMC Sierra. Get 20% below MSRP on next generation 2019 GMC double cab and SLE crew cab models with a standard tailgate.
Oh, there's something so real about living local, and I know without a doubt I'm not alone. And I'm loving living local. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. Said I'm loving living local. Local 24 is always there for me. The Mid-South is where I love to be.
And that's going to do it for Local 24 this week. If you'd like to comment on the program you saw here this Sunday, the email address is rransom@localmemphis.com, rransom@localmemphis.com. My thanks to Otis Sanford, Susan Adler-Thorpe, and Lee Mills for being here on this Sunday, and my thanks to you as well. We'll see you next time for Local 24 this week.